Welcome again to our Ask the Pastor series in our midweek studies. Want to call your attention to Genesis chapter 2:24, Matthew chapter 19, as we answer the question, what about polygamy? The question that came in was this: in the Old Testament, there were many wives. Brothers take their dead brothers' wives in marriage. Where in the Bible does it say marriage is between one man and one woman, and when did it change? Okay, so in order to answer this question, I need for you to think in terms of God's ideal, the way He established it, the way He set it up. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about ground rules that God had established, and I want you to think in those terms, that there are ground rules that God wired into creation. And then I want you to think in terms of how those ground rules, how we ignored them or shifted away from them, okay? And that's going to help us answer the question. So, Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. This is God hardwiring His ideal into creation. Genesis 2:24, therefore, God says, man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. All right? Jesus said it in Matthew chapter 19, verse 4. He said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. What God has joined together, let not man separate. Now, in Matthew 19, we think in terms of divorce and remarriage, and certainly that's true, but it also applies to the issue of polygamy. So the very first thing I want you to hear is that God's ideal for marriage is monogamy. It is marriage between one man, one woman for life. There's a covenant that God cuts between a man and a woman in marriage, and that covenant is established for all time. So when we look at how God set up marriage in Genesis 2:24, there's one man, Adam, there's one woman, Eve, and He joins them together as one flesh. The one flesh statement is huge. One flesh statement is unassailable when it comes to the issue of monogamy. One flesh means just that. Two become one. And it's not three become one, or five become one, or 100 become one, but one man, one woman, two become one flesh. As we look at this passage, all the commentators and scholars agree that the one flesh statement is a powerful statement of God's purpose in marriage, and it's God's ideal and the goal to which humanity was commended to return. Even as Moses is writing the Pentateuch. Now, I believe Moses wrote the first five books of the Bible. So Moses, inspired by the Spirit of God, is writing the words of God to humanity. He is led to see backward in time to the events of creation, how that God made man in His image and in His likeness, that God made man and woman. And if you remember in Genesis 2, the making of the woman, that God breathed life into their nostrils, the breath of life into their nostrils. But Genesis 2 tells us that God put Adam in a deep sleep, took a rib from his body, and with that rib, put it into Eve and created Eve, and bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. That's the language there in Genesis 2. One flesh union, one. And so monogamy is God's ideal. So when Moses is looking back in time and he's looking at this creation of man and woman, he writes down the one flesh statement. And that is a commendation for the children of Israel to practice monogamy. Now we know that even the heroes of Scripture had violated. I was reading 1 Samuel chapter 1. I'm going through 1 Samuel chapter 1 personally, and in reading 1 Samuel chapter 1, you have the record of a man named Elkanah, who was apparently a devout and faithful follower of God. He had a wife whose name was Hannah, and another wife whose name was Peninnah, or Penny, I call her. And yet, in the midst of that violation of God's ideal with two wives, which, by the way, caused great disharmony in the home, Elkanah still went to Shiloh to offer sacrifices to God. He was obedient to offer sacrifices to God, but he was disobedient in pursuing God's ideal of one man, one woman. Abraham had something of that kind of relationship. He had his wife Sarah, his lifetime one flesh union, and then he had Sarah's maidservant Hagar. And again, that was the purpose of the union between Abraham and Hagar, was to procreate a son. And yet they did it in a way that was disobedient to God's ideal. David never used David as an example, or Solomon as an example on how to do marriage. David did marriage poorly, and it is reflected in the disharmony in his home and the destruction that his disobedience to God, one man, one woman for life, covenant marriage, it created, causation is not always correlation, but there is a connection between David's hundreds of wives and concubines and all that stuff, and the disharmony in his home. The very devastating effects of his polygamy led to a division within his home, even kicking him out as king, his son Absalom overthrowing him. And that was a direct result of having more than one wife. Jacob had Leah and Rebecca or Rachel, one of the two. He had two wives, and they were sisters, and it created great disharmony in the home. There were 10 sons of Jacob who were from Leah, and 2 sons that were from his true love, his one flesh, it seems, wife, Rachel. And those two created great division. So you had the 10 sons of Abraham from Leah who were jealous of Joseph and put him in a pit and sent him into slavery. The dysfunction in the home can be traced. It may not be all connected to polygamy, but it's certainly polygamy contributed to that disharmony. So as you look at Scripture, you see that God's design was one man, one woman for life. Monogamy was God's design, and it's hardwired into the creation story. So the doctrine of creation itself leads us to a monogamous relationship. The only biblical exception to monogamy was levirate marriage, Levirate marriage. That's the only exception that I could find when it comes to monogamous marriage, and I'll explain it. But first, turn to Deuteronomy chapter 25, Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. Now, God is giving the children of Israel instructions on how to do life as they prepare to go to the promised land. In 25, beginning in verse 5, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn son which she bears will succeed to the name of his dead brother, and his name shall not be blotted out of Israel. Verse 7, but if the man does not want to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up a name to his brother in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of the city shall call him and speak to him, but if he stands firm and says, I don't want to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the presence of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house, and his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal removed. All right, so all that language, what's the point? The practice of levirate marriage was an important practice, but understand the exception here. So for a widow, if she and her husband are living in the house or the homestead, think homestead, with her husband's brother. So here are at least two families, this man and his family, and his brother and his family. And the brother dies, leaving the wife a widow and sonless. So it's not just that she's a widow, it's that she doesn't have a son to carry on the name, again, hugely important in the ancient Near East, doesn't have a son to carry on the name in Israel of her dead husband. Then God says, here's what can happen. The brother fulfills the duty of her brother's, as his brother's husband. So he goes in and he says, okay, we're going to have an heir for you. And because I am connected in bloodline and we are in the same homestead, then you're going to be my wife, and I'm going to fulfill my husbandly duties to you so that you might have a son. It wasn't an act of, it was not an act of sexual pleasure or promiscuity. It was an act of continuing the lineage of his brother's home. Now, say what you will about that. That was an ancient Near East practice. God permitted it for the continued lineage of one of the families in Israel. But that is, in my reading of Scripture, that's the only exception that Scripture gives. So everybody else, Elkanah with Hannah and Penny, he is being disobedient to God's ideal. David, with his several wives, being disobedient to God's ideal. Samson, disobedient to God's ideal. Jacob, being disobedient to God's ideal. Although Jacob was fooled into having two wives. But regardless, God's design for marriage is one man, one woman, united as one flesh for life. I hope that helps when it comes to the issue of polygamy. God's ideal for marriage is monogamy, one man, one woman for life. Two passages, Genesis 2:24, Matthew 19:4 through 6, and then the only exception in Deuteronomy chapter 25. Next week, we're going to be answering the question, is the sin nature passed down by the human father? So we'll unpack how is the sin of Adam in Genesis 3, how's the sin of Adam and Eve imputed or passed down to you and me? And we're going to look at Romans chapter 5 to answer that question. I hope that's been helpful for you, and as it has been for me on dealing with the issue of polygamy, and we'll come back next week.